call the meeting of the Mobility Stakeholder Group to order. Let's start with a roll call, starting with Mr. Driftmeyer.
Don Driftmeyer.
Stuart Waldman.
Carrie Ann Farrell-Hines.
Jose Campos.
Dominic Franzella.
And that establishes a quorum. Welcome to Ms. Carrie Ann Farrell-Hines to our Mobility Stakeholder Group, our newest member, veteran now of the CBA, but new to the Mobility Stakeholder Group. So welcome aboard.
Thank you.
We've got topic one, approval of minutes from the November meeting. Would entertain any comments or motion?
I move to approve.
Second.
First from Mr. Driftmeyer, second from Mr. Waldman. Any further discussion? Any comments from the public? Call for the vote.
Jose Campos,
Yes.
Don Driftmeyer,
Yes.
Dominic Franzella,
Yes.
Carrie Ann Farrell-Hines,
Yes.
and Stuart Waldman.
Yes.
Motion carries. Topic two is it's a written report only on decision matrix and objectives. Entertain any questions or comments. Seeing none, we'll go on to item three, timeline for activities regarding determinations to be made pursuant to BPC 5096.21. Ms. Bobasagi, turn it over to you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. The purpose of this item is to allow the MSG to discuss items related to the timeline for practice privilege activities pursuant to Business and Professions Code, Section 5096.21. I would like to draw your attention to the page 3 of your attachment, referencing the dates July 2017 and September 2017. The timeline was updated to reflect the recent authority the CBA obtained to initiate an emergency rulemaking to remove states from the no-notice, no-fee practice privilege program. Staff recommend that the CBA adopt their revised timeline. I'd like to turn it over to the chair.
Thank you. So any comments on the timeline? I think I would highlight a couple of things for the committee. I think in general, the progression of this timeline has indicated an acceleration of actions relative to whatever was in the original roadmap. And I think we've experienced that from the outset in terms of the formation of the committee, the evaluation of the various states, the NASBA enforcement guidelines, and coming to some level of conclusion on those items. And so that's continued through this point in time. There, as you can see in the timeline information, there is a requirement for this committee to proceed with a final report that is due to the legislature by January 1st of 2018. And so that is certainly one of those remaining to-dos of our committee, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about process here, I think, in a few. And so that'll probably be the next steps of our timeline activities, and I think what you see summarized is consistent with that particular fact. And so good news in terms of the work of the committee. Any comments before I would entertain a motion on adopting the revised timeline? Yes, Mr. Driftmeyer.
Just real quickly, I'm looking at this. We will get those, final 2 states, or I think there was 2 or 3 states that were out there that were still on the edge, that hadn't either made their decision to come to the table with the requirements that we were looking for or not.
And we could probably speak to that in the, well, just to recap on that piece of it. There are 10 jurisdictions currently that have been determined to be substantially equivalent, but which do not comply with the internet disclosure flag that they need to have on their websites. And so it's that piece that appears to be an administrative, logistical system issue for the states. They're feverishly working on that, but that is part of the continuing evaluation that this committee would do to assess whether or not those 10 states can achieve full substantially equivalent status if they can overcome whatever challenges they might be facing currently. And so we're down to those. I don't know that our materials necessarily identify who those 10 are, but that's been part of the record thus far from prior MSG meetings.
Thank you. With that comment, I would move that we adopt a motion to accept staff's recommendation.
Second.
I got a first from Mr. Driftmeyer and a second from Mr. Waldman. I see a theme coming on. Any further discussion? Any input from the public? I would call for the vote.
Stuart Waldman,
Yes.
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines.
Yes.
Dominic Franzella,
Yes.
Don Driftmeyer,
Yes.
and Jose Campos.
Yes. Takes us to item 4, motion carries. That takes us to item 4, review and possible approval of the 2016 Mobility Stakeholder Group Annual Report. Welcome, Mr. Bone.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. The purpose of this agenda item is to provide the MSG an opportunity to review and approve the 2016 annual report. The MSG annual report describes the actions and activities that the MSG undertook in 2016 to ensure compliance with California's practice privilege laws. Since the MSG last met in November of 2016, staff made a number of minor updates and clarifications to the report. Some of the more substantive changes, however, include updating the various statistics to reflect all activity that occurred through the end of 2016. On pages 2 and 3, the background section was enhanced to include additional information regarding Senate Bill 1405, and this section now includes a discussion of the CBA's responsibility to review each state's enforcement practices. And in the activities and accomplishments section, beginning on page 7, staff clarified the descriptions of the process and the timing of the assessment of each state, including the collaboration between NASBA and the CBA staff. If I may, I'd like to direct the members' attention to section 9 of the report, which is on page 10, about halfway down. The section is titled 2017 Anticipated Topics for Discussion. The final bullet of that section currently states that in 2017, the MSG will be discussing the MSG's final report to the CBA and the legislature. Chairman Campos has asked the staff to adjust the wording of that bullet to make clear that the MSG's final report of their activities is directed to the CBA, and that the MSG will work with staff to develop a preliminary draft of the CBA's report to the legislature this year. Staff requests that the MSG approve the 2016 annual report with this change and direct staff to provide the report to the CBA for their review and consideration. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my remarks, and I turn it back to you for comments or discussion.
Thank you for that overview. Comments, questions from the committee? And I think inherent in that item 9, and if you read the various bullets, obviously one of them around finalizing decisions on states that have not yet been identified as substantially equivalent refers back to the 10 jurisdictions that we just spoke about. And then right below that, any subsequent rulemaking or what have you that we may have to, propose or embark on as a result of that ultimate evaluation. And so appreciate that. Any other comments on the annual report? I would entertain a motion.
I move to adopt the report.
Right, we're changing the process. I got a first from Ms. Farrell Hines, and I got a second from Mr. Waldman. Okay, we're staying steady on the second there. I like it. Any further comments, input, comments from the public? Call for the vote.
Don Driftmeyer,
With appreciation to the staff, yes.
Dominic Franzella,
Yes.
Jose Campos.
Yes.
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines.
Yes.
And Stuart Waldman.
Yes.
Motion carries. Thank you very much. Item 5 is review and consideration of the current practice privilege program provisions of the Accountancy Act and possible recommendations on whether any legislative changes are necessary. Ms. Movasagi, turn it over to you again.
Thank you. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to mention that on Tuesday, March 21st, an email was sent to members with a memo from the stakeholders associated with SB 795. So which should be in your red folders. According to the stakeholders, there was an inadvertent drafting error that will be corrected as SB 795 moves forward. Additionally, as identified in the memo, the primary purpose of the legislation is to repeal the January 1st, 2019 sunset date from the no notice, no fee practice privilege program. This agenda item's purpose is to provide the MSG the opportunity to discuss, to review and consider the current practice privilege provisions in the Accountancy Act and determine whether legislative changes may be necessary. On February 17th, Senator Kathleen Galgiani introduced SB 795, which would remove the January 1st, 2019 repeal date of the CBA's practice privilege program, therefore making the program permanent. Staff do not have a recommendation on this item, and I would like to turn it to the chair for any questions and discussions.
Thank you, appreciate that. The purpose, as was laid out of this particular agenda topic, is just to evaluate current practice and law in the context of what's going on in the environment. And so that's the reason the agenda topic is on. The memo that was circulated, I guess so many numbers on this, I can't tell what to refer to it as, but I guess it's under item, what number is relevant to me as the MSG committee here? Item 5? MSG item 5, memorandum dated March 21st. I think it clarifies some information on there nicely that certainly raised questions as to how current provisions that are important, I think, within the law or the regulations would be impacted by whatever is being proposed. And so that was helpful. Any comments or questions or issues from committee members at this point? I certainly have a few points or highlights that I think might be relevant, but thought I'd turn it over to.
Just a question on maybe I'm oversimplifying it, reading through this, is we have a sunset date as of 19, to the end of 2019, currently, as I understand this, for this particular part of the code, the practice privilege section. And if we go ahead and submit what we're submitting in the first of 2018, that would, after we work out the technicalities and how it's going to be done with the staff, we'd have to review it again in a year later, and because it would go away. And this bill is to keep it from going away and making it permanent. Is that what is too simplified read into this?
Might be quite paraphrased, but I would just clarify the current sunset date is January 1st of 2019, and the bill, in essence, seeks to remove that sunset date, right, to maintain the current set of regs that we've been acting upon. It does not alter or impact the other responsibilities that we have as a committee to the CBA as to the final report, the monitoring activities of the various states, all those kinds of things that we've embarked on, continuing to evaluate the 10 jurisdictions that we do not yet see as substantially equivalent. Those responsibilities continue. But yes, in essence, it seeks to remove the sunset date. The couple reactions that I certainly had as I sort of thought about that concept, right? We've got a final report that we still need to draft, review, approve for purposes of going to the CBA and for the CBA's then subsequent actions. And so just thinking through that, but also juxtaposing that against the length of time it takes to get legislation approved to change something, and that's the action that it would take to remove a sunset date. And so as I thought through those topics, I mean, I certainly believe as I indicated before, the MSG has acted timely with respect to all the requirements that are in the law that has been adopted and part of the practice that we need to operate under. We've already recommended that 45 out of the 55 jurisdictions are in fact substantially equivalent based on the process that's been detailed out in the annual report that we just approved. The remaining 10, while already considered substantially equivalent with respect to the enforcement guidelines and those things that we embarked on, have the logistical issue of the internet disclosure, which is a requirement and which we need to assess in finality, and if we conclude that they subsequently are not substantially equivalent, then there's provisions in the law as to what we need to do around those particular licensees from those particular jurisdictions. No issues, I think, have been identified by our committee to date with respect to the mobility law or the regulations or the things that we've had to operate under. That's gone well. The final report to the legislature, another procedural step, we'll embark on that, and I think we'll have an opportunity under agenda topics for the next meeting to think about what do we want to do to prepare and make sure the committee is well informed as we proceed down a path of having that done. And so with that, as I looked at SB 795, or at least the proposed items, I didn't see any issues with removing a sunset date based on that body of work thus far. There were questions that I think got addressed, and it sounds like there is an intention to modify some of the investigatory authority and regulatory authority that's built into the law. And then there's the whole question of if you consider a jurisdiction not to be substantially equivalent, then there needs to be a notice process, right? And the only concern I had is that it seemed to strip that out of those portions were going to come out, but there needs to be a mechanism to allow for that notice fee or whatever that's going to look like that reverts to the old form of practice privilege that we had. And so that was one concern that I had as I looked at the initial draft of this, and how does that relate to the current law and the tools we would need to have a mechanism for states determined not to be substantially equivalent to operate in our jurisdiction. So long-winded way to say I didn't see any further concerns, assuming that those items that are laid out in this memorandum we received get resolved in normal course of a legislative process. Yes, Mr. Griffin.
Would it be, and again, ask council, would it be appropriate then to say, because the legislative committee has weigh in on this, I presume, that our recommendation is to watch this particular proposal and look for the necessary amendments or changes that staff might make in regarding to your comments, or?
I don't know that we need to make any kind of formal motion. I think anything that impacts the mobility practice and regulations is something that we have to be mindful of and observe in the context of the any changes that are being proposed. I don't know, would it be appropriate to indicate that certainly some of the items that are mentioned in this memorandum, again dated March 21st, under clarification responses to initial questions, are consistent with sort of observations we would have as a committee, and that we would be interested in assessing that those are appropriately considered in any final legislation that obviously could have impacts on our ability to monitor this area.
Yeah, if you're going to make a recommendation, I would suggest that you make the recommendation to the legislative committee. That way it goes to that committee, and that's built into the discussion of the bill proper and their recommendation to the full board. So that would be my recommendation. If that is something you would like to do, you can make a motion for the legislative committee to consider whatever proposal or recommendation you'd like to make.
I would so move your motion.
Why don't you make it your motion?
Yeah.
I think
To
what I heard
recommend to
Mr.
recommend to the
Driftmeyer's,
legislative committee.
I heard Mr. Driftmeyer's motion to be that he would recommend that this committee would recommend to the legislative committee that the items identified as factors to consider in this March 21st, 2017 memorandum under clarification responses be considered by the legislative committee in its oversight of this particular legislative proposal.
That's correct.
Does that sound like your motion, Mr. Driftmeyer?
And remain mindful.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll
Yes.
second your motion, Mr. Driftmeyer. Any further comments or questions? Comments from the public?
Good morning. John Ross on behalf of the KP Public Affairs on behalf of the national accounting firms. Not particularly on Mr. Driftmeyer's motion, but just one item to underscore that sort of connects the legislation to the work of this committee, and that's some of the timing considerations that you raised before, Mr. Campos. It's unlikely that SB 795 will receive final consideration by the legislature until such time as they receive your report. The original legislation said, board, please prepare a report to guide our consideration of whether the sunset should be considered. So if the report is delivered to the legislature pursuant to the statutory deadline of January 1, 2018, and consideration of the legislation then is delayed until the summer of 2018, and the bill is enacted at the end of that year and signed by the governor in September, it's not effective till January 1, 2019, which is actually the date of your sunset repeal, and it could create a bit of a squeeze for the board in the consideration of regs and other things that might be necessary to implement that law. When the original mobility bill was passed, SB 1405, it was we knew it was enacted in September. It didn't become effective until June, so there was effectively 9 months to go through the regulatory process. You are looking at a bit of a time squeeze potentially at the end if the legislature doesn't act until next year. It's partly for that reason that we thought it prudent to start the bill this year, whether we finish and get it all the way through the process to get as far as we can, pending receipt of the report. Obviously, the sooner the report hits the legislature, potentially the sooner the legislature will be in a position to consider this. So that's just, I think, where the bill and your work become very intertwined.
I appreciate that clarification. Any other input from the public? Call for the vote.
Don Driftmeyer,
Yes.
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines,
Yes.
Jose Campos,
Yes.
Stuart Waldman,
Yes.
and Dominic Franzella.
Yes.
Motion carries. Thank you. Item 6 is discussion regarding NASBA activities and CPA Verify. Ms. Mobasagi?
Yes. CBA Executive Officer Patty Bowers attended NASBA's 35th Annual Conference for Executive Directors from March 14th through the 16th in New Orleans, Louisiana. Some of the major topics on the agenda included legal cases and other developments impacting the profession, continuing professional education audit tools, and education accreditation. Deputy Attorney General Carl Sani attended NASBA's 22nd Annual Conference for Board of Accountancy Legal Counsel and presented on tips for investigating an alleged audit violation. At the November 2016 meeting, Chair Campos recommended that staff compile a reference list of all state accountancy boards enforcement contacts and updated periodically. Currently, staff receive the NASBA committee handbook and state board listings, which does include the executive officer's contact information for each state. And this contact list may provide the most helpful information for CBA enforcement staff to use when investigating out-of-state disciplinary cases. At this time, there are 51 jurisdictions participating in ALD and CPA Verify. 4 states, Delaware, Hawaii, Utah, and Wisconsin, do not yet participate, and it is anticipated that Wisconsin will be participating at the end of the year, and that, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. Any questions? One interesting piece with this, while ALD is the internal database, right, for boards to access information from each other, but CPA Verify is a publicly available aspect, so certainly our consumers in California could access CPA Verify to get information on licensees for those jurisdictions that participate on CPA Verify. And you put that against the 10 jurisdictions, right, that do not have internet flags on their websites. But yet all 10 of those are participating in CPA Verify, and so there is a mechanism of information to be available, and there are different aspects of those, but it, certainly probably a mitigating matter is in terms of the availability of information on licensees as we go forward and continue to work with these 10 jurisdictions that are still trying to figure out how to deal with it on their own websites, right? But the four jurisdictions, my screen's real small, that remain, right, that do not yet participate on CPA Verify are not among the 10 jurisdictions that do not currently have an internet flag. And so those 10 already are doing this, and these 4 already do their own flags on their own websites. But I just find it an interesting little logistics item to consider as we go forward. All right. Anything else on item 6? Item 7 is discussion regarding proposed agenda items for the next meeting.
At this time, in addition to the standing agenda items, staff are proposing the following topics for the next MSG meeting. Number 1 is to further review any additional states identified by NASBA as substantially equivalent. Number 2 would be the draft of the MSG final report to the CBA. And 3 is in consultation with the chair earlier this week, staff recommend an agenda item to discuss a possible framework for the CBA's report to the legislature, including the criteria used to evaluate the current practice privilege program and whether it affords more, less, or equivalent consumer protection than the predecessor program. Staff welcome MSG input regarding any additional topics it wishes to explore, and this does conclude my presentation.
So those 3 topics, I probably would put them in a slightly different order, right? The 10 jurisdictions, then deliberating or at least brainstorming on, there are 3 very specific provisions in 5096.21F, right, on what our final report needs to address. Items 1 and 3 are relatively straightforward within that. Item 2 is what Ms. Mavasagi just mentioned on opining on whether this is more, less, or equivalent to the former practice privilege process we had in regards to the protection of consumers in the state. And so that's one that certainly I think we would need to come prepared to deliberate and think about the factors or the items that might make sense to think about there. And so just wanted to highlight that for the group. Any other topics that we would need for the next agenda? All right, do we need, those have just been suggested. Okay, is there any further business before the mobility stakeholder group? Any public comments? All right, we're adjourned.